Hi, everybody. Welcome to this session. Special thanks to Belter for sponsoring today as well. We're here today to talk about legal issues for second, third, fourth, however many locations you're looking at. My name is John Szymankiewicz. I don't expect anybody else to pronounce Szymankiewicz. After the first 30 or 40 years, you get used to it. That's why it says John S. on my wherever it is over there. That thing that has my name on it. My name is John. I'm with Beer Law Center. I practice beverage alcohol law. All I do is work with breweries, wineries, and distilleries, mostly breweries. That's where my heart is, and have been doing so for about the last 10 years. It's about all I do. So eat, live, and breathe this stuff, and my vacations are beer vacations. I was just telling Andrew, I just got back this past, what day is it today? Today's Tuesday. I got back in town on Saturday after spending 2 weeks checking off a bucket list item. I went through, my wife and I took a road trip through Bavaria, visited little towns and breweries for about 2 weeks. Fantastic. My liver still hurts, but that doesn't stop me from still drinking Schwarzbier. So cheers. All right. So today, second, third, and beyond breweries and tertiary locations and tap rooms and so forth. I want to talk about some of the legal stuff here. I'm going to touch on some of the other pieces as they relate to legal issues, but I'm going to leave off a lot of the, do you have the right demographics for that location? Is it the right cost per square footage? All that sort of stuff. I'm going to leave that stuff alone and kind of focus on, in particular, the regulatory stuff, the corporate structure stuff, a little bit of finance bits, and hopefully go through some what not to do. So I am also trying to keep track of the chat and comments as things come in. I'm going to try and answer those. If you haven't been to one of my presentations before, you'll find I am pretty laid back and pretty informal in my speaking. So, if you have the thought, put something in the chat, let me know. I'll be happy to try and address it as we go along, because honestly, I don't have a ton of slides here. I'm really hoping to kind of have a conversation, tell some stories, and give you a little bit of, okay, do this, don't do that. Here's something to think about, and here's what it means. For me as a lawyer, it's real important for me that clients and anybody understands not only what to do and what's going on, but why that's important and why we need to focus on that. So, I tend to try and give a lot more background in those sort of pieces than otherwise, or than a lot of folks do, I should say. All right. So just by way of a preview, here's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. And corporate structure, distribution, production on site, employees, and then some stuff about what not to do. All right, so hitting first on a corporate structure, here's the real question, and a lot of things will flow from this. When you're going to open another location, is it actually going to be the same company, or is it going to be a separate entity? I've worked with clients in both categories where, all right, there's 3 partners in the LLC and things are going okay. And 2 of them go, okay, the economics are forcing us, most of our margins are from over the counter, over the table, bar top sales. So that means we can only sell so much in our little tap room area. We can only pull in so many people. Nobody, fewer and fewer people are going to drive an hour to go sit in a tap room for a couple of hours. So if we want to get a new audience, we need a new tap room in somewhere else. So, and we need that because the margins are better there. We can put some product in distribution, but the margins aren't as good. So we want to try and stay in the tap room business. Great. So 2 of the partners say, yes, we definitely need to open another tap room. I think it needs to go in this area. And the other partner's like, no, I'm done. I'm not putting any more money in. I don't have any more time in my life. I can't go run another place. I only wanted to do this for this, or my life circumstances have changed. A lot of that happens after, say a brewery has been in business for 2 or 3 years. Okay, the world has changed. Somebody maybe started this and now they're married or have a kid, or God forbid going through a divorce, or health problems, and they're like, no, I'm not doing any more of this. In some of those situations, one of the answers is, okay, let's go form another LLC that's going to own that second tap room or that third tap room. And either, partner A and partner B are just going to go do that on their own, or maybe they'll get in a new investor that's going to be just part of that tap room and not part of the brewery or first primary tap room. Okay, now things get interesting. Like I said, and I'm not going to read the slide to you necessarily, because I know everybody can do that. But in general, I see that situation when it's an investment vehicle, right? When, for whatever reason, somebody wants to do something that's different from keeping it within the same LLC or the same corporation that started the brewery or the original tap room. Now, some places, some states won't allow that at all. It must be a wholly owned location. It must all be in the same LLC, same corporation. So you need to check that before you go down that path. But where it's allowed, even where it's allowed, you may have to get some special permissions. Where I am in North Carolina, absolutely you can do that, but you need to go to the ABC and get special permission. Go, hey, we know this is a separate LLC from this one over here that you've already approved, but they're the same brand. So you just need to give us permission to have this common ownership or slightly disparate ownership with the same brand. Treat this one as if it was part of that one, right? So there may be some administrative hurdles that you want to look at there. And then one of the things that makes that very difficult, or can make running that sort of business difficult, is you're going to have a hard time sharing employees between company or between locations, because that employee is going to be managed based on their time and that the taxes due on their wages. And those are going to be through two different EINs, both federal and state, for tax purposes. So they're going to be employed by two different companies. You're going to pay two different sets of taxes. They're going to get two different checks if you try and have one employee work in both locations. So that's something really to think about as a separate entity. On the other hand, the flip side of that, and again, maybe push you towards a separate entity situation, is if it's all the same. Well, now if you've created another location, if something bad happens at that location or at the original brewery location, the assets are all commingled, right? So you've just increased your asset value, and now you've created exposure for those new assets to old liability, or created exposure for your existing assets to new liability with the new location. So, if you're doing something that's a little more risky or a real stretch, well, that can be a problem if you've got issues with creditors, with leases. You can't pay your lease, and a lot of your commercial leases now will say something like, oh, and if you breach the lease, you owe us the rest of the term of the lease, going to when it would have finished to begin with, or when it was the original end date. Well, if your second location breaches that lease, guess what? They can come after the original brewery, and you got assets over there. That's, wait a minute, time out. That's not such a great idea. So you want to be careful about putting all of your assets in the same liability bucket. But like I said, if it is all one entity, it is easier to manage employees across location. You can just go, hey, Mike, today you're over at the brewery, tomorrow you're over at taproom 2, right? So, here's your work schedule, here's how this is going to work. And that's especially useful for, of course, your front of house staff, right? Your bartenders, beer tenders, less so for like cellarmen and brew house employees. But those folks who are on the front lines, who honestly, as a management issue, tend to have more frequent call outs or scheduling issues where you need more flexibility. That's where you'd start to be concerned about that. Whereas if they're separate entities, you can't just go, hey, Susie, Jack called out at the tap room. Can you run over there and take a shift? Well, unless she's already an employee over there, it's a real hardship. Now, you may be able to work out like a the brewery is going to rent this employee over to the tap room. But again, that becomes a financial headache to try and track. While we're on the subject of finances, if you do have them in separate entities, like I said, separate tax returns, separate books, it does keep that a lot easier to sort out, because again, you're going to have completely parallel pieces. So it's going to be really easy for, say, the investor that's only an investor in the tap room to say, oh, I can see exactly what's going on in the tap room by looking at the books, and not see everything that's going on in the brewery. But they can see, okay, yep, I see where we spent all this money on people, we spent this money on beer, we spent this money on rent, here's what we brought in, I get it, I understand that stuff. But maybe that same investor doesn't need to see, here's the cost of raw materials, here's all the brewery lease payments at the current facility, all that sort of bit. So there are pros and cons for both. If you want to go down that road, it's just a couple of things you really need to think carefully about before you jump in and make that happen. All right, I think I got another slide here on corporate structure. And here's where things get even more interesting. So again, I'm based in North Carolina, and North Carolina is a long, skinny state like Tennessee, and we've got one or two states that way and one or two states that way, and in particular around the Charlotte area, around the Outer Banks area. Well, the state line is really close to some of these areas, especially in the tourist area. And so I've talked to clients a lot about, okay, brewery in Charlotte, we've got a really strong brand recognition, and we're pulling from a metropolitan area of 20 miles in diameter, and part of that is in South Carolina, and we're getting a lot of pull, people coming from South Carolina. It's not that far of a drive, but that's some folks we're not getting. We want to put a tap room in South Carolina, just on the other side of the border. What does that mean? Oh boy, now things get really interesting. First is tax consequences. So not only do you have to worry about your federal and state income taxes, but you may end up having to pay state tax in both locations, depending on how you're generating your money. So put that in perspective. And it's called nexus, right? Is the finance tax word to describe this, is how much and what activities are you doing in that other state such that you should have to pay that state's income tax as well as your own state's income tax. I'll give you an example that's one that I've dealt with is, okay, so I'm licensed in North Carolina and Virginia. I do a little bit of work in Virginia. If I did a lot of work in Virginia, especially if I went to Virginia to work, had an office there or something like that, then I would be subject to Virginia state income tax and North Carolina state income tax, at least for that part of what I did there. Oh my gosh. All right. So that's not a cool thing. You can actually tax yourself into a hole. But when you're talking about crossing state lines, it's a major concern. Here's the other one. Can you actually distribute to yourself across state lines, or do you need to go through a distributor? Now, in those states where there is no self-distribution, it doesn't matter. You always are going to have to go through a distributor to get to that next retail location, especially if there's not brewing on site. If there's brewing on site, different discussion, hold that thought, we'll come back to it. If there's not brewing on site, well, you're going to have to go through a distributor to get there. But in states where you have self-distribution, I'm going to pick on North Carolina again, your self-distribution rights end at the state line. So you cannot distribute to a tap room in another state. So how do I do that? I hear you ask. Well, going theory is if I own a brewery in North Carolina and I want to put a tap room in South Carolina, I have to give my distribution rights, at least some of them, in South Carolina to a distributor who I will then buy my beer wholesale from to sell at my tap room in South Carolina. Well, crap, you say, why would I do that? I'm giving up that margin. Yes, that's the point. That's why it's very difficult in those situations where if you can't self-distribute to it, you're going to lose some margin, right? Now, on the other hand, if there's brewing on site, right? So I'm opening a tap room, but I'm also going to put a little brewery in that tap room. well, that's, what's a brewery? And from both a federal and a state perspective, you'd be surprised at how little it takes to actually be considered a brewery. One of my dubious distinctions as a lawyer is I worked on what I think was the smallest brewery to be licensed in North Carolina. It was a 5-gallon homebrew system, single vessel electric. But we got it licensed, and so it was a brewery. And that meant, under North Carolina law, you could contract brew. And that's what I really wanted to do. I didn't want to own a brewery. You wanted to contract brew the stuff and distribute it. So that worked out well. Point being, maybe what you have to do, or maybe what you could do, is put a teeny tiny brewery in that location in that other state. And then you can use basically contract brewing, right? Where little brewery in South Carolina, I'm just going to use North and South Carolina as an example. Little brewery in South Carolina is going to hire my own big brewery in North Carolina to produce South Carolina beer for it. And it gets shipped down there, and it's as if that South Carolina brewery had produced it. They owe the excise tax in most cases, and you've eliminated that wholesale distribution chain or level. So that may be the case. However, you have to look really closely at those other state laws because, one, that may not be allowed. Two, even if it's allowed, it may be subject to certain restrictions. I know of jurisdictions where, okay, yes, you can receive beer from a contract brewery that was producing it somewhere else, or one of your own breweries, an intra-brewery transfer. But if you do that, X amount of the beer sold on site must be made on site, right? So some sort of limitation on, you can't do my little bitty brewery example. So there's some concerns there. Whole different set of discussions when you're going to cross that state line for that next location. And there are folks out there who do it, but it is a big step, and it's got to be the right fit to take on the risk, the legal differences, and it's a whole different management discussion because, one, it may be a little bit more remote. Two, I guarantee you the laws are different. So what you could do in a tap room in Virginia, you may not be able to do in a tap room in North Carolina or DC or West Virginia or whatever. So you're going to have to think real carefully about, do all those things work still? All right. So I think next one was talking a little bit about distribution. So tap room distribution, this is where I want to talk a little bit about planning ahead and keeping your options open. So if you own a brewery and your state allows self-distribution, can you self-distribute to your new tap room? Well, generally the answer is probably going to be yes, unless you have already signed up with a distributor for that territory, for that area. Now we've got a problem because under most franchise laws, and franchise laws do vary a lot state to state, but in most cases, beer franchise laws say the wholesaler has the exclusive right to market and wholesale beer in that territory. They're the exclusive brand representatives of that brand in that territory. No one else can sell your beer to a retailer in that territory. Well, that's kind of a problem depending on how your state looks at things, because most states that allow self-distribution, you're acting as your own wholesaler. Well, if you're acting as your own wholesaler and you're distributing to your own retailer, that's infringing, that's stepping on the toes of that distributor you've already signed up with as the exclusive wholesaler for that territory. So that's a real problem. This is why it's so incredibly critical when you sign up with a distributor, don't just sign whatever they put in front of you. And for God's sakes, don't just start working with the distributor without a written agreement, because these are the things you want to get somebody who understands beer franchise law and make sure that you're keeping your options open, because one of the first things you can do is reserve those rights and say, no, I can always, generally speaking, I want to be able, let me back up. Generally speaking, subject to some beer franchise law limitations, you can reserve certain rights. So yes, Mr. Distributor, I'm going to let you distribute my beer in this county, but I'm going to reserve the rights to always distribute to my own tap room if I put one there. Right? But you have to be very proactive about that. Most beer franchise laws read a lot into that, even if there's no discussion of it. If it's the only one there, it's the only one there. You didn't say that you kept these rights, you gave away all those rights, they're gone. So distribution, critical there for the tap room. What about package distribution? If your package is going across state lines, like I said, do you have to buy from a distributor? Can you transfer that? What if your distributor covers both states, right? So I see this a lot with beer franchise and distribution agreements where I sign up with a distributor in North Carolina and I give my distribution rights to the western half of the state to distributor X. Great. And then I want to put in a tap room in South Carolina. I want to sign up with a distributor there. But the distributor I already signed up with also distributes in South Carolina. And I didn't read my distribution agreement very well. And it says they have first right of refusal on any of my products in any territory I expand into. Well, does that mean I am now married to that distributor in South Carolina as well as North Carolina? Maybe I could have negotiated a better deal with a different distributor. Maybe I had somebody who was, I had found somebody distributed in South Carolina that does really well there, but the distributor I'm with only has a few people out there and doesn't even have a warehouse in your area. Well, crap, now I'm stuck with things. So this is a real problem from a packaged product versus taproom distribution. And I realize those may be very similar, but of course, for taproom, you're typically talking about shipping kegs back and forth to sell on draft over the counter. But if the state allows it, most folks are also doing packaged product. Well, can I get that beer from the same way I did the kegs, or does it have to go through distributor? So you have to parse those slightly differently. And of course, and if you're crossing state lines at all, federal approval is required on your labels. It's not always required in every state, but if you cross state lines, COLA approval required. All right. Going back to that next discussion about, okay, what if I do go ahead and put a brewery over there and now everything's great, right? Well, maybe, maybe not. One, can you transfer bulk beer between breweries and across state lines? Within a state, generally, you're going to be able to do that. Across state lines, if they're both your breweries, probably. But you need to look at the receiving state as well as the sending state as to what it may require a different set of permits or a different permission from the state. And then that may affect when taxes due or by whom, right? Where was the tax paid? Federal tax, they don't care which brewery pays it. State tax, they care. Where was it produced, here or there? Is packaging sufficient, or am I going to be charged on the bulk? Generally, it's not going to be on the bulk. It's going to be on packaged product because excise tax is due when it leaves the brewery for consumption or distribution. And in those situations where you're transferring bulk beer, like totes, tanks, those sort of things between breweries, that's not a packaged product. But what if it is packaged product? What if you've got kegs that you're shipping from one to the other? Ooh, good question. Is this now state excise tax due because the product is leaving my brewery in North Carolina, going to a retailer in South Carolina, or is it going, no, it's not going to a retailer. It's going to another brewery, my other brewery in South Carolina, and that it's like that brewery had produced it. I was just contract brewing it for them. They're going to do that. Okay, so you have to kind of think through how this is going to be done. And for God's sakes, make sure you keep track of this stuff on a very detailed basis in your financials, right? Product going in, product going out. Where is it going to? Where is it being received at? Is it going to the brewery, or is it being transferred to the tap room? Okay, those are two different things because, in some states, a brewery is a commercial activity and a tap room is a retail activity. If you send it to a retailer, that's distribution. If you send it to the brewery, oh no, that's contract brewing. You can run afoul of the tax implications and the legal implications pretty quickly if you're not tracking this correctly on your finance side. Okay. All right. So that's a bit about distribution. What's next? Just some high level stuff on if you are going to brew on site at your second or third location. Keep in mind, I said obviously, but it's not entirely. You'd be amazed what people don't think about. These are separate federal and state licenses. The federal government and every state I've ever talked to track your permits by your license, or by your address, excuse me, by your address. So separate location, separate permit, separate location, separate license. And of course, depending on what state you're in, it may be a very specific license. Is this a brewery with a tap room, a brewery with a restaurant? Is this a brewery with a music venue? That, you know, how is this all broken up? What activities are going on site? Do you sell for off-site consumption, only on-site consumption? All those pieces is going to factor into how you are licensed in that other state. If you're crossing state lines, it's obviously going to be within whatever your state looks like if you're staying within the state. But is this going to be a separate tax entity? What do I mean by that? Well, you've got a couple of things going on. One, is it the same LLC or corporation? That's going to be your FEIN, your state and federal tax IDs. But even if it's the same company, you're going to have two different excise accounts. You're going to have one for location 1 and one for location 2. That means you're going to have two different brewers reports of operations, two different excise reports and tax returns that are going to go in, both for federal and state in most cases. Okay. We talked a little bit already about transfers between brewing sites. Generally, that's going to be allowed, but you need to make sure the receiving state, especially, how they're going to look at that from a tax and regulatory compliance perspective. Yeah, if you're crossing state lines, if you're within the state, that shouldn't be an issue at all. You should be able to transfer between brewing sites without concern. Double checking your local jurisdiction. I know that's true where I practice, but this is not legal advice. The other issue with putting in even a small brewery or putting in that next brewery at that taproom location is it does allow you to better utilize your capacity. What I typically, or what I'm beginning to see with folks is, you know, the general wisdom for years and years has been, you know, buy the biggest brewing equipment you can afford because you're going to use it. You're going to need that capacity. And so there's a lot of breweries out there that have a lot of good capacity, but we're also seeing, well, no, the consumer now wants variety. No, I need to see more. I want to see the new IPA this week. I want to see the new hazy coming out now. No, I already had last week's goes. I want a different goes next week or next month. And unless you're turning around in your tap room or have a large distribution network, if you're not turning around, 20 or 30 barrels of that stuff in a week, it doesn't make sense to use some of these large tanks and large brewing capacities. So this could be a situation where, okay, maybe it does make sense to put in maybe not something as small as 1 or 2, but a 3 or 5 barrel system with smaller tanks at a second location. So you can do fast turnaround things, smaller batches that are going to be one-offs and distribute to both locations and do bigger runs, bigger flagships at the larger brewery that you probably already invested in to fill the pipeline around your flagships at both locations and any distribution you're putting in the market. So there can be some advantages to doing that if you can transfer back and forth without any problems. Okay. All right. Next up, talking about employees. All right. So this is one of the things that causes me, I won't say heartburn, but a lot of concern for a lot of my clients when they are looking at two different locations. think real carefully how you're going to manage that second location or third location. If you've already got a second location, managing a third, it's not as difficult, but opening that first location that's not where you are all the time, how are you going to manage that? How are you going to staff that? And as you get to second and third locations, the real challenge here is consistent management. And you, for God's sakes, please have an employee manual. Please have policies and follow the policies. All right, so I'm getting a little ahead of myself on the slide. Let me back up and say, when you are managing employees, one of the sort of tax rules that's kind of pounded into our heads early on is your location for tax purposes and workplace purposes is where you start the day. If you go to your normal location and then they say, okay, I need you to go to this other tap room to cover a shift this afternoon. All right, you probably have to pay for that time and the transportation, not the transportation, but pay for that relocation. And now you've got a separate work location. So you have to be very careful about what that tax consequences look like and payroll consequences if you're having people move around between locations. That's especially a problem if you have them move between jobs. Then we trigger all kinds of interesting employment law things when you say, okay, Bill, you're the taproom manager at this location. And so I'm going to pay you I'm going to pay you $25 an hour to be the manager supervisor over there. But once a week, you're going to cover a shift over that tap room as a bartender, and I'm only going to pay you $12 an hour for that. Okay, so we got a couple of problems here. As long as those are clearly delineated and Bill has no supervisory responsibility at that other place, can he be involved in the tip pool over there? Or can he receive tips? North Carolina, the answer is probably. On the other hand, while he's the manager over there, absolutely cannot be a part of the tip pool, even if he's doing bartender stuff, right? Because that's management, and management can't receive tips, can't take part in a tipping pool, at least in North Carolina. Check with your jurisdiction, but that means it gets really freaking complicated. That means that you have to have very clear instructions, very clear lines. All right, Bill, what is your job when you're here? What is your job when you're here? And do you have, for example, solid and consistent job descriptions for each of your employees? A lot of my clients don't. And I think that's a huge mistake, especially if you've got employees at two different locations who have two different supervisors, but are doing very similar jobs. If I treat Susie different than I treat Jane, and they're doing the same job, something's wrong. So, it's that consistency in application of job duties, expectations, performance, discipline, and that leads us to that next thing, employment manual. Consistent management is based on an employment manual that lists your policies. The only thing worse than not having policies is having policies and not following them. So if you do have an employee manual, I strongly suggest you do, make sure you're following the policies. In that employee manual, and again, you can band-aid, you can cover up, you can work through the uncertainty a whole lot easier in a single location than you can in two locations. In two locations, you typically have two different supervisory roles. You have two different crews, depending on when it is. And I'll give you a great example. What about call outs for inclement weather? Well, depending on how close your tap rooms are, could be great at one and absolutely death defying to try and get to the other. What does that mean? How do we decide to close? How do we decide when employees have to show up or can call out, or all those sorts of things? There needs to be a policy so everybody's treated similarly or the same, so that every time it rains over there, Bill says they're closed, there's a hurricane over there and I got to go to work. What the heck, right? So it's that very, what are the requirements? And that's going to go down to things like call out, shift beer policy, especially how things are treated there, disciplinary policies. What's the process? What does it take to get written up? What's a verbal warning? What's a written warning? Anything around employee training, all that sort of stuff. We need to have consistent rules that are applied consistently, and that begins with a written manual. Okay. All right. That's the employee stuff. Now, I think I get to talk about some of the, I won't say fun things, but where I get to tell some stories about what not to do. And I'll tell you if I've seen every one of these, or I'll tell you if I've seen it when I get to it. So the first one, sign a lease without checking with zoning. Yep, I've seen that happen. Don't do it. Signed a lease and then find out that they're in a specific zone that won't allow bars. Well, I'm not a bar. I'm a brewery with a tap room. Well, what does the zoning say? Well, they say I'm a bar. You're in deep trouble. I'm happy to take your money and argue with the city. Do you want to pay me to do that? Or do you want to try and get out of this lease or do something different? Because you don't want to force a municipality or a zoning department to take you if they don't like you. Especially if you're going into a small town, if the town doesn't want you there, it can make your life miserable. If they want you there, they'll get the zoning fixed, right? So before you pick a location, you better check with zoning to make sure you can do what you want to do there. Well, I was planning on putting a brewery in there. Well, zoning says you can put a bar, but a tap room, but not a brewery. Ooh, okay. What does that mean for my plan? At the same time, along with zoning, do your research on the areas. Please don't just go to an area and go, this is pretty nice around here. I bet a brewery would go really well here. No, check your demographics. You can get a lot of information from the city, county, business development organizations about where people have discretionary income, how far they drive for, different services, what the growth rate is like, all those sorts of things. Please do the actual database research. Don't go, well, Cousin Earl said that shopping center is going to be great in about 2 years. Well, crazy Cousin Earl drives a 78 Olds Cutlass. I don't think I trust him with this one unless it's a really nice Cutlass, maybe. Who knows? Anyway, so do your research. Second, don't hire an inexperienced location manager. Well, what does that mean? Well, the thing that I'd be concerned about is for that second or third tap room, if you're not going to go there and manage it, you're going to need a deputy. You need somebody there on site that you trust to manage that location. That should probably not be somebody's first experience with managing a location. So, my first thought would be, I'm managing, or I've been front of house, I've managed my brewery with tap room, and I've got a tap room manager that they do great work. And, they had been promoted up from, beer tender to supervisor, team lead, and now they're the tap room manager, and they're doing a great job. And now I want to open another tap room. Do I want to see if she wants to go manage that new tap room? Well, you can always ask the question. But if that person has come up all the way through to taproom manager working for you in your location, that's different than being off in a remote location, right? That's not, 10 feet from your desk or a cell phone text away. It's, well, I might not see, John for a day or 2 days, and I have to make these decisions on my own. And if, by the way, if you're calling me to make every decision, you're not helpful as a manager, right? So think very carefully about how you're going to manage that, and maybe you want to break it into a couple of phases, because you may also not want to hire somebody in from outside who has been an experienced taproom location manager but has never been with your company before. Okay, because part of that second location is, how does it fit with your brand? How does it fit with your story? Is it managed the same? Do you treat employees the same? Because they're going to be different employees for the most part. So are they treated the same as the people who are in your flagship location, right? Or your original location? How have you ported that culture over to that new spot? In some cases, maybe you don't want to port that culture over to that same spot, or that same culture over to that spot. What if you're opening a, pick something, you've got a brewery in a metropolitan location, and now you're going to open a tap room at a seasonal location. Well, seasonal work, at the beach or the mountains or something like that, that's a lot different. You get boluses of people. You need a lot more people in the season than you do in off season. That's going to be a bit of a different culture, quite frankly, than if you're in where you've got pretty well stable employee requirements month over month. Again, I'm thinking of a large metropolitan area or something. So how are you going to staff that? How are you going to manage that stuff? You want to think about in that decision on hiring an experienced location manager, maybe not. The second one kind of ties closely to that. Are you going to treat employees or customers different from one location to another? Maybe you do. Maybe you want to do that in some cases. But if you do, you better be really sharp and think through why you want to do that. If you want it to be a different kind of experience, okay, cool. Like maybe we've got our brewery with our tap room with rustic looking and old plywood, and we've been here for 15 to 20 years, and it's always looked this way. And we're going to open a new tap room that is a high-end, elite, glamorous, different experience, right? We're going to put in that's going to be our showcase for our sour program, right? We're only going to serve in tulip glasses or flutes, and this is going to be a very different experience. All the seats are leather and mood lighting, and we've got a great wine selection there, and it's going to be different. Okay, cool. If you want to make that separation, great. You have to be very intentional about how you do that. On the other hand, most folks, when I'm opening a second location, I want that to look like my first location. I want people to go to one and know it's got our name over the door. They know they're going to get a certain experience, certain customer service, certain quality, because it's the same folks. We're expanding our brand. We want that to be the same. So how are you going to do that? How are you going to ensure that happens? Especially if it's at a further distance. It's one thing to be across town. It's different to be across the state, right? Where it may be a 3 or 4 hour drive or more to get to that other location. But that was the place that makes the most sense to put that location from a demographics, from a growth standpoint. It needed to be out there. How am I going to do that? Okay. Don't sign a distribution agreement without reserving some rights. Saw this happen. Somebody signed a distribution agreement, wanted to open a second tap room, and they had been having arguments, or they weren't on good terms with their distributor to begin with. And the distributor raised their hand and said, well, you don't have rights to distribute to that tap room. The distribution agreement you signed 7 years ago says I have rights in this county. Well, that stinks. Now, we were able to sort it out with some discussion and a nominal payment. But the issue was they could have been a real pain about that and forced the brewery to buy their beer from their own distributor to distribute to their own tap room. And again, chunk of that margin goes away. Does this tap room make much sense anymore if we're not doing that? Open in another state without a lawyer in that state. Saw it happen. We've got this. Hey, John, can you tell us about this? Nope. I am specifically prohibited from telling you about the state law in a state I am not licensed in. I can tell you what I think. I can tell you what it would be in North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, or DC. And I could give you some general guidance, but no, you definitely need to find a lawyer in that state that knows the laws in that state specifically, and especially if you're doing any distribution. Beer franchise laws, very different state to state. And of course, the ABC and selling stuff, very different state to state. Next thing, don't try to do your own taxes. Saw that happen. Once you get 2 locations, your books double or more than double, right? Everybody understands, if I'm a brewery with a tap room, I've got a cost center for the brewery, I've got a cost center for the tap room, I've got a profit center for the tap room. The profits for the brewery either go through the tap room or from a sale to a distributor. This is how these work. Here's how all this stuff works out. Well, great. Now, once you have that second location, not only do you have double those pieces, now you have all the stuff that works out in between, right? So transfers from one cost center to another. Transfers, well, we talked about employees as well between locations and payroll. And something else about that, I was going to say around taxes. Oh, yeah, that was what. Things are taxed differently. So if you have a manufacturing facility on the same location as your retail facility, you may get different tax treatment because of manufacturing tax treatment or tax credits versus purely retail. So what assets are in what category are going to have an impact on that. The other bit is your assets in that new location are on a different depreciation schedule. So as you know, if you buy a fixed asset over a certain threshold dollar, we're going to depreciate that year over year. Well, now you've got a completely separate set of assets that may be depreciating at multiple rates because you've got second location. So that's a problem, or it can get very complicated. And if you are not knee deep or better yet waist deep in the tax code every day, this can cause real problems. And it's a whole lot easier to pay to have it done right than it is to have to pay to redo it or correct it later. Right. That's all I'll say about taxes on that bit. Don't cannibalize your own customers. Saw that happen where folks are coming to a tap room. Gosh, we're doing really well. We want to expand into another tap room, but we don't want it to be too far away that we can't manage it. We'll open it up, 10 miles away. Ooh, that may have been too close because now, some of the customers who are coming to the tap room were driving that 8, 9, 10 miles, but now they're not. They're going to that other location. And unless we can replace those and get more, we've just cannibalized some of our own business. Which moves into the next one. Don't move into a saturated or a vacant market. Saw both of those happen. And I've seen people get trapped in between. Okay, so first discussion is if there's a market that's not being served. Oh my gosh, this is a beer wasteland. Why isn't anybody, opening a tap room here? Well, there might be a damn reason for that. It might not be, but there might be, and you want to figure that out. If you can be the first and there's a market there, great. That's going to be good for you. But there may be a reason there's not a brewery there. Could be zoning, could be city politics or county politics, could be land use. It could be, there's a lot of money, a lot of expensive houses around here, but nobody stays here. They go to the next town over for, food or drinks or whatever. They don't, it's a bedroom community. They don't get home till 7 or 8 o'clock at night. Lots of things that could be red flags there. Don't move into a saturated market. Look at all these breweries that are doing really well here. I should put a brewery here as well. I'll do well too. Well, one, I guarantee if it's saturated, they're not all doing well. Somebody's struggling more than somebody else is. And at that point, you're all competing for the same group of people. So it quickly becomes a zero-sum game. It's not increasing the size of the pie. There's only so many people we can get in this location or in this 3 or 4 mile radius, and now that it's getting eaten up by more and more people. So you got to be careful there. And then I've seen something that surprised me, but I guess it wasn't all that surprising because it's happening more and more. Point being, brewery moved into a beer wasteland. There was no good local craft beer within 20 miles in a 20-mile diameter. Open up a nice location, great place, no food, but good, plenty of capacity, great, almost a destination tap room, and they're doing great for a couple of years. 2 years in, somebody opens a brewery like half a mile down the road because they were like, oh, there's only one brewery here. That's not a lot of choice. We should open a tap room or a brewery here and maybe we'll get some of that. Sure enough, they did. And the area had not grown considerably. So without new people coming in, that literally took a chunk of business away. And it was almost like 20% gone the first day because they didn't have to drive that extra half mile or mile to that to the only other brewery that was there. So that really hurt the original brewery's business. How are we going to deal with that? We can't stop people from opening up. But again, we only have so many people. So this is one of those, having to deal with and be careful where you go and when, and what's that look like for not just the next year or 2 years, but next 5, 6 years. How is this place going to work if another brewery opens up 2 miles from where you are? How's it going to work if 2 breweries open up within 10 miles of where you are? Is that going to kill your business plan? Or is this place growing so fast, it's not going to matter? You're going to have to think about all of those pieces. And I say these kind of fit in with legal issues because all of your business plans are based on that, right? If you are based on your business model. If you can't meet your business numbers, you're talking about breaking your lease. You're talking about letting employees go. You're talking about, thinner staffing. You're talking about potentially skimping on quality, right? To get more out there to reduce costs. All those things end up with some legal aspect, and especially if you loosen the management strings, because we had to let the taproom manager go because we couldn't afford it, and now we've gotten 3 ABC violations because nobody's out there paying attention to what they're doing or what they're not doing. Right? They're not carding anybody, or they're not they're drinking on shift and those sort of things. Which I know state to state those things vary. And then the last one. And especially from a trademark perspective, don't fail to consider your brand or your story. If you've built your brand and your identity around who you are, your story, your next location, be careful not to change, or if you do, make it very intentional to change that story. For example, if I'm John's Brewery and I'm going to open another location, but I want it to be Mexican themed. So it's going to be Juan's Cerveceria. Can't even say it. Cerveceria. Great. I might be making more money. I don't have any trademark or brand recognition there either. I haven't just expanded my trademark. I got to go do a completely different thing because that's a different brand. People don't realize that's, the common consumer may not figure that out. And even if they do, if it's different, are you alienating the folks that got you where you are, right? By changing that story or that brand. So that's, I think, most of the stuff I wanted to cover. I am down to just a couple minutes left on this. So I'll throw out my contact information. I haven't seen anything in the comments or the chat. Yep, no, I don't see anything there. I hadn't seen questions. I would love to answer those. But if you watch this later or think about anything else later, contact us. All our contactee stuff there is on the screen. And I started putting this quote on a lot of my presentations. I think I'm going to put it on my tombstone. And if I have credit for anything, I really like this thought. You don't go into something like this without some confidence that it's going to work out. But if you're not absolutely terrified, then you don't understand the situation. So a little bit of healthy fear goes a long way. If you have anything, any questions, comments, reach out to us. There's our social media stuff. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care.